Joining us now, our good friend, Republican Congressman District 1, Rob Wittman, fighting to get a budget passed. He's a lonely man up there. Now, he submitted legislation that said if you don't have a budget, you don't get paid. Of course, that got bottled up in committee, went nowhere, but he's a lonely voice. Also, Rob Wittman, a candidate for governor, Virginia in 2017. That'll be likely decided at a convention. He knows something about conventions because he's already won one of them. And I think he's going to be a very formidable candidate next May at the convention. Congressman, good to have you with us, man.
John, great to be with you this morning. Thanks for having me on.
We had Congressman Griffith on earlier, and basically he's saying exactly what you're saying, that at the end of the day, when it's all said and done, there's going to be a lot of talk, no action. We're going to get to November, and they're going to set their hair on fire again and say there's no budget, we have to pass one, we can't shut the government down. And what he was saying is that's how they get all the crap in this thing, because nobody has any time to snuff any of it out.
Well, that's exactly the case, John. And, you know, Morgan and I have really been vocal with the leadership to get them not only to get a budget, but also to get these appropriations bills through, if not at least some of them, because then we can get those things to the president's desk, and that's where you can make measurable progress on reducing the deficit. And there has to be fundamental change, too, to the rules about how the House operates. Right now, when the budget is adopted, two-thirds of the budget are essentially off the table. So all of the autopilot spending programs you cannot address through the budgeting process, which to me is absolutely ridiculous. So Morgan, myself, and others have been very vocal to say, you know, why are we tying our hands, especially when we know we need to manage the other parts of our budget? And let's get appropriations bills done, which, you know, involve the discretionary part. Let's make sure we get those done on time. And all of those things, you know, must be done. I don't think we ought to leave town, as I've said time and time again. I don't think we should be able to leave town at the end of July for this ridiculous August recess until all of those appropriation bills are done, because we know it's going to happen. It's designed chaos. You leave town for 5 weeks, you come back with 12 or 13 legislating days before the end of the federal budget year, and then, as you said, crisis management, everybody runs around, and we know we're going to have some kind of a continuing resolution or an omnibus budget bill. So you jam a ton of stuff in there, and just as we saw last year, I voted against it, and I vote against these CRs and omnibus budget bills. You have no time to digest what's in there, a couple thousand pages of budget language, and everybody says, oh, you got to pass it or else, instead of saying, you know, we know how to avoid this crisis management mode, and that is get this stuff done beforehand. And, you know, I think at least Speaker Ryan is trying to get us to that operation of what they call regular order, and essentially getting things done on time. But it is monumentally frustrating, John, to know, you know, clearly what you need to do and then not see it being done, and knowing what the outcome is going to be. It's not like this is anything that's held in suspense. We know what's going to happen if we leave town for 5 weeks in August. Last year when Speaker Boehner was there, I begged him. I said, Speaker Boehner, if you're going to be a leader, you will call us back in August. And I didn't even get a response from him. So I just am, you know, deeply frustrated with the process and knowing what we need to do, and yet year after year after year not seeing it get done.
Well, you're the chairman, Dr. Wittman, of the Military Readiness Committee. I mean, you have a very powerful position in the House. You're tremendously respected from anybody that I've talked to when I'm ever up there. So how could they not respond to you?
Well, I
you're
think,
Rob Wittman.
Speaker Boehner and I didn't have the best of relationships. He and I saw differently on a lot of different things, and for whatever reason, he chose not to respond back. You know, I do have a good relationship with Speaker Ryan. I've talked to him. I think he realizes it. He has committed to me that he's going to do everything he can to get as many of these appropriations bills to the floor and out of the House as we can. He has tried to work with the Senate to make sure that they will move these bills, because in order for this thing really to make sense and for it to happen, we have to move our appropriations bills out, and then the Senate has to move them out to get them to the president. So I know he's trying with everything that he has. This appropriations process needs to start. They were trying to get the budget done a little bit earlier. As you know, April 15th deadline is right around the corner to try to get that done. That's the starting point for these. So we want to make sure that those things happen on time. And if you stay on track with this, there's a lot of effort that goes into passing these appropriations bills. If you stay on track, I think that you can get all of them passed by July. And if not, lay out there right now, John. I've asked Paul Ryan to say, lay out right now. Tell the members, our effort is to get all 12 appropriations bills done by the end of July. And if we do not, we are going to work into August until they're done, so that folks can say, okay, I better plan on staying here in town if we don't get the work done. And it provides, I think, much more of a motivation to get the work done prior to the end of July if people want to go back to their districts in August.
I mean, it makes too much sense for it ever to pass, right? Anything...
Well,
right? I mean, look,
it's amazing,
anything.
John. I have lots of support for the No Budget, No Pay Act, but I can tell you it is tough to get people to sign on to the Stay on Schedule bill that says, get it done by July or else you're not going home. It's amazing how people, are saying, no, I've got to go home. And I said, listen, I understand you got to go home in August, but 5 weeks and with all this work yet to be done. So you're right. It is tougher than what I would have thought to get that through.
Well, you can't even get out of committee. Look, I mean, anything that makes sense in there never goes anywhere. It's the things that don't make sense that seem to get traction. By the way, we're with Dr. Rob Wittman, Congressman, Republican 1st District. He's also the chairman of the House Readiness Subcommittee. Let's look global here for a minute. You've now got a deal where the Russians are selling armaments to Iran. You've got that going on. Some people talking about trying to block it. Other people saying that Iran is now violating the deal that they made with us before the ink is dry. What do you make of this whole thing?
Well, John, I do think it's a violation of the agreement that was put in place, but we should not be surprised by this. And I have said from the very beginning that this deal was deeply flawed, and we knew that the cash that was going to be freed up and given to the Iranians that they were going to use to buy conventional weaponry. We knew that was going to happen. Mm-hmm. And here it is, so it shouldn't be a surprise to us. And we know that those arms will not only go to Iran, but Iran will also distribute them to forces sympathetic to Iran, like Hezbollah, like some of the rebels in Syria. So we know that that's going to further the conflict in the Middle East, which to me is mindless in why the president decided to go down the road with this Iran nuclear deal. We give them all the benefits up front. We see right now they're not following any aspect of that. They're continuing to test launch platforms that can be used to deliver nuclear weapons. We see them working with North Korea in developing a nuclear weapon. All these things that they were supposed to do, they're not being done. And now also the administration says, well, we have some concerns. We need to look into the things that they're not doing. Well, it was so blatantly obvious, the faults of this agreement, that I don't know why they are surprised at this particular point. But they have the wherewithal to purchase these conventional weapons, and I fully expect that they will continue to do that, not just for them, but for forces sympathetic to Iran or those that want to further Iran's purposes in the Middle East.
Dr. Wittman, I want to get your thoughts on this. A week ago, Donald Trump, right now the front runner for the Republican nomination in 2016, challenged the conventional thinking on NATO, saying, look, NATO was developed almost 7 decades ago, and it was developed in response to the Soviet expansionist empire, the Iron Curtain, all that. He said, if I'm president, this thing has got to get re-looked at. We're paying 89% of what the NATO funding is, yet there's 27 countries in it, 26 that we have to defend. He said that doesn't make any sense economically. Do you share that view? Do you think that NATO should be reevaluated?
Well, I do think there are certain aspects of NATO that do need to be reexamined. So in some sense, I do agree with the direction that Mr. Trump is proposing that we go. I've just got back this past August from traveling to visit our allies there, the Baltic states, Estonia, Lithuania. I went to Poland, I went to Brussels, Belgium to visit. Most of the countries there are doing their part. Under the requirements there, 2% of their GDP. Now, prior to that time, prior to the aggression by Russia, they were not. So there is at sometimes a malaise that sets in with NATO partners. And one country that's not doing the things that they need to do is Germany. And I would agree that the countries that aren't pulling their weight need to be confronted and need to be put on task and said, are you part of this or are you not? And what are the true functions of that? As you know, there is a conventional threat there, obviously, with Russia. There's also cyber threats there, and the question is how far does NATO go in addressing the full scope of threats? I do think that there are more things that NATO partners can do within the cyber security realm, within the cyber warfare realm, that they're going to need to do. It never hurts to examine relationships between countries and the basis behind NATO to make sure it's doing all the things that it needs to do. And one of the concerns that we've all had is all the countries abiding by their commitment in spending 2% of their GDP in support of NATO. And until recently, that hadn't been happening. But I do want to give credit to the countries that have stepped up to the plate. You saw the Great Britain now has done the full commitment there and has done that, committed that over a 5-year period. You saw Estonia do the same thing. In fact, Estonia is actually going to get to the full commitment. It was going to be 2018. Now it's going to be 2017. And of course, it takes a while for them to do that through their budgeting process. But they're committed to do that and are accelerating that, as well as Latvia, and of course, Poland has been very good about doing their full complement. But I don't think it ever hurts to sit down and examine those relationships and make sure too that our commitment is strong with those nations, and the Article 5 provisions that said if one is attacked, it's an attack on all. And we do have to look about what our NATO partners have done to help the United States. They did help us in Afghanistan, and that has been significant in that conflict, over 1,000 casualties from NATO partner nations. So they have done their part. The question is of proportionality. Who is carrying the load there, and how do we make sure that is fair and just under what all countries benefit from in their NATO relationships.
So I want to get back to what you said earlier about Germany not carrying their weight recently. So what's the deal with Merkel there? Why are they lagging behind? What's the issue?
Well, they shouldn't be, John. They have a very, very strong economy. They have some different thoughts about what NATO should do. I think NATO, in order to be effective, has to be timely. It has to respond aggressively to actions like we see from Vladimir Putin. They have been somewhat hesitant in that, more of a pacifist mentality than a strategic strength mentality. And so I think a lot of that goes into their thought about their contributions to NATO. But I think, aside from what they think the tactics and strategy of NATO should be, it's clear what their obligation to NATO has to be. And they can be part of the discussion with the other nations about what the NATO policy needs to be, and they have been. And they have been hesitant to be direct and strong in responding to Russia, which I think is a mistake. I think Vladimir Putin only understands one thing, and that is strength and determination.
Right.
But aside from that kind of mentality that we see in Germany, their obligation under NATO is clear, and we can have the debates among NATO and the members about what the strategy needs to be and what our tactics need to be, but you cannot be weak as a NATO partner and expect for all nations to be equally as committed to NATO. And that's why I think Germany needs to be put on task and say you have to be committed to making the full contribution there. And it's not as though there's a fundamental weakness in their economy or that they can't do that. They can do that. They choose not to do that for a variety of different reasons.
I tell you what, you're spot on, because there's 27 nations in NATO. You have to really ask yourself, how many of those relate to any strategic interest in the United States? So that's one thing. And the other question is, you've got one major nation, Germany, that has a totally different view on what it should be, and they're not pulling their weight. Final thing I want to get to, not to flush out one presidential candidate, but I think some of the things that were said the other day are food for thought. Another thing Trump said is, look, if I'm president, I'm going to be open to allowing Japan and South Korea to get nuclear arms, let them defend themselves. We're paying all this money. We got people there. Pakistan's got nuclear arms. So to some people, that looks like, wow, you'd be in favor of nuclear proliferation. To others, people are looking at that saying, well, yeah, why do we have to defend them? Does that make any sense or not?
Well, I do think it's a different realm when you go from the questions of conventional forces and alliances in defending nations on a conventional sense versus nuclear deterrence and nuclear defense and nuclear proliferation, and especially in that area of the world. I don't think strategically it makes sense to encourage Japan to develop a nuclear weapon, and especially with the history of Japan and nuclear weapons being deployed there. I just don't think, from Japan's standpoint, that that's a political reality. And I'm not certain either that in South Korea that expanding nuclear weapons into a country like South Korea and Japan is the answer to countering those efforts in the region. I do think, though, that working with them to develop a deterrence to those other nations and defensive capabilities, which we do. We have our sea-based ballistic missile defense systems on our Aegis destroyers that are there to sense and to shoot down a weapon were it to be launched. I think that's probably the more effective way strategically to go about that region. I'm not sure ramping up, having additional nations with a nuclear weapon is necessarily where we need to be, because as soon as Japan has one, there's pressure on South Korea to have one, and when South Korea has one, and there's pressure on other nations in the region to have one, places like Australia and others, and that's not, I think, ultimately where we need to be. When the more countries that have nuclear weapons, the greater the number of chances are for something somewhere to go wrong. And the problem is with that is if there is a miscalculation, that is catastrophic. If there's a miscalculation there, it's bad enough right now that we have Kim Jong-un with his finger on the button, and where we understand the small amount of distance between the decision makers in the military and Kim Jong-un. My concern is that, as you see, if any of his military leaders disagree with him, he essentially executes them. We saw essentially his chairman of the Joint Chiefs of Staff be executed recently. So you can see that any type of pushback against Kim Jong-un by his military leadership is not something that extends your life. So my concern is, a miscalculation there, and if you multiply that by potential miscalculations in other areas there, it's not a scenario that I think is in the best interest of security throughout that particular region. So I do think you'd have to think long and hard about saying more nations with nuclear weapons somehow makes things better or makes things safer.
Okay, that is going to be the final word, and I'm going to make a prediction. April the 8th, I'm going to predict the 2016 presidential ticket. Trump Wittman. Save this tape. Trump Wittman 16. You just heard Rob Wittman. That would take him out of the governor's race. He'd be the vice president. This is the John Fredericks Radio Network. Trump Wittman, you heard it right here. Just go to whitman.house.gov. Hey, Congressman, thanks for being with us. You're either
John,
going to be,
thanks so much. I hope you and your listeners have a great weekend.
You're either going to be vice president or governor. I'll see you next time. This is the John Fredericks Radio Network.